I'm Henry Harbin. I'm a psychiatrist. I was introduced earlier, so I don't know that I need to repeat it again, but I'm on the board of the Maryland Mental Health Association. I'm also an advisor to the Kennedy Forum. And we've got a very interesting panel today with a mixture of elected officials as well as some experts in this area. And we're going to talk about how do we try to streamline and accelerate the regulation of these new treatment technologies as well as the reimbursement of them. So that's our topic. We have two esteemed and well recognized, they should be introducing me, not me introducing them, because they're both known to everybody in Maryland, Congressman Steny and Senator Ben Cardin. We're really pleased that you all would be here. Now, Senator Cardin is, in the theme of this thing, is going to be here virtually. He decided with the technology being our focus, that's what he would do. So we've got a brief clip of him introducing this and talking a little bit about the importance of these, and then we'll go to the rest of our panel and have a conversation. So we have Congressman Hoyer. We have also two people from the FDA, Allison Kumar and Peter Como, who are very involved in regulating and reviewing a lot of these specific, actually some of the companies you've heard today have been reviewed by Peter at least, and maybe by Allison. And then we have Chris Thatcher, who's the president and CEO of Neuronetics, which is one of the first transcranial magnetic stimulation companies. So we're going to start, if we have that on first, with Ben Cardin, and then we'll move on to the rest of our discussion.
Hi, I'm U.S. Senator Ben Cardin. I'm sorry I can't join you in person at the Mental Health Association of Maryland's Brain Futures Conference. I know how much work so many of you have put into the success of this conference. I'd like to acknowledge the efforts of Linda Raines and her skilled team for managing this event from start to finish. I also like to thank Dr. Henry Harbin for moderating the forthcoming panel that will feature my friend and colleague, Congressman Steny Hoyer. Few issues matter to me as much as advancing the cause of mental health care in this country. I am gratified to know that you have spent the last 2 days examining so many challenging issues, promising treatments, and important policies. The struggles of mental illness are all too real. And for those in the midst of debilitating disorders, any and all support we can give makes a real difference. Every one of us has dealt with mental illness in some way. It strikes across racial, ethnic, and gender lines and affects Americans of all ages. Studies have shown that nearly 25% of the U.S. population currently suffers from a mental illness, and about half of American adults will develop at least one mental health disorder in their lifetime. Despite the prevalence of mental illness and the effectiveness of high-quality evidence-based mental health treatment, barriers to assessing mental health care continue to exist. According to the Kaiser Family Foundation, more than 60% of adults with disorders do not receive any mental health services. Costs are a major barrier preventing them from receiving care. Stigma and other barriers, such as limited capacity in some areas to serve all those in need, also played a significant role. That is why your work is so urgent. Adults with serious mental illnesses die 25 years earlier on average than other Americans and face an increased risk of chronic medical conditions. In the Senate, I'm excited to be working to improve access to and quality of mental health care in our country by integrating mental health care services into primary care contexts, specifically through the collaborative care model. This month, the Senate passed legislation I authored to extend the duration of a demonstration program that allows individuals with severe mental illnesses to receive the help they need. This keeps them from becoming stuck in the revolving door of emergency room visits, relapses, jail, homelessness, and death. My legislation extends the current 3-year Medicaid emergency psychiatric demonstration, providing timely, cost-effective, and life-saving care to individuals who are experiencing an emergency psychiatric crisis. These steps forward must be seen as a beginning and not an end. Working together, I know we can improve our nation's healthcare system and to begin to make lasting progress. And so we must fight for improvements to our mental health care system, to dispel misguided perceptions, and to raise awareness about the devastating effects of mental illness. More than that, we must improve the lives of those who suffer from mental illness in our communities and ensure that they have the support necessary to allow them to reach their full potential. Please note that you have my unwavering ally in the United States Senate. I deeply appreciate your efforts to help those in need and urge you to remain undeterred in your important work. Thank you.
Please, we have one of Senator Cardin's staff here, Renee Cohen, so I want to please tell him thank you very much for his comments. And I know personally that both Senator Cardin and Congressman Hoyer have been very long-standing supporters of healthcare access, both in Maryland and their state roles, as well as on the federal level, and have also been big supporters of the federal mental health parity law, the MAPEA law that passed in 2008, and have also been very helpful in continuing to try to make sure that law gets enforced. And that'll be one of the topics we're going to talk about, because it's key to whether or not we can get some of these new treatments reimbursed in the same way they do in medical stuff. So, company to get the idea, refine it, then go to the FDA, and now then get reimbursement. Congressman Hoyer, I was going to make it clear.
I'm sitting here depressed.
Yeah, right. Well, you could get this.
We got something for you.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're covered. What insurance do you have?
From what you just said, it's going to take 13, 14, 15 years before I get covered.
Right. So, but I just want to explain, we've been talking about this technology earlier, but you weren't here. So this is a transcranial, basically it's a magnetic pulse that's given externally. And it's a new kind of treatment that's being used for treatment-resistant depression. A large number of people don't respond to the first or second psychiatric med they get. And this is, in the past, you either went to like electric shock treatment where you have to induce a seizure basically, and you use anesthesia. This doesn't require anesthesia. It's a low kind of pulse. And it's regulated by the FDA, I think, as appropriately. But even with this, which has good data, the insurance coverage part of this post-FDA clearance is very inconsistently covered and very slow, which was meant to be addressed by the federal parity law, but the federal parity law has not been completely implemented or enforced. But so why don't we hear from Peter and Allison, I don't know who wants to go first, a little bit about how you all regulate this. I don't want to get too long on this, but with this, we've had some earlier discussions in the last 2 days, Congressman Hoyer, about we have a lot of apps and digital therapies separate from this that are being innovative and new, and that's in an area where we've had a lot of discussion with the FDA about, well, which of those are you going to regulate, because they're not like a device like this. So. But it'd be helpful to hear just how you all regulate and what you think we could do to speed up the timeline. And
okay, thank you. I guess I can start first. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Just by way of introduction, my name is Peter Como. I'm a medical and clinical reviewer in the Division of Neurological and Physical Medicine Devices at the Center for Devices and Radiologic Health at FDA. Prior to joining FDA, I was in the Department of Neurology at the University of Rochester Medical Center for 25 years, taking care of patients with various neurological and psychiatric problems. So just a couple of real quick points, because I don't want to hog the stage. The timeline. Often FDA is criticized about very long timelines to either get medical devices or drugs approved. And it's important to recognize, especially with regard to medical devices like TMS, that the review process has to be based on a pivotal clinical study, and in some cases you need more than one for drugs. And then that clinical study, once it's submitted to the FDA, has to be reviewed by us. And that review takes a considerable amount of effort, because it's going to involve a clinician reviewing the clinical data and the results. It's going to take probably a biomedical engineer reviewing the inner aspects of the device and make sure it meets all of the federal and international regulations for safety with regard to electrical safety and other things. If the device is to be worn or touches the patient in any way, there are some issues about biocompatibility that need to be reviewed by an expert in that field. And then finally, our colleagues in statistics need to look at the study results and how they were analyzed and see if they arrive at the same conclusion that the sponsor did regarding the two key things. One, that the product is safe, and number two, that it's effective in the intended use population. In Chris's example, this would be major depression. So it's important to get a sense that it's not just a simple matter of looking at a document and saying yes or no. It involves a considerable amount of review by an expert review team at the agency. Now, one of the things that lengthens the timeline, it's important for you all to recognize that it's not entirely FDA driven, because if a sponsor does not come to FDA early and often in the development of the pivotal clinical study, when they come to us, they may have done the wrong study, or they may have not used the proper outcome measures to show that their device or their treatment was indeed effective. And one of the things to speak to Dr. Hardin's comments about how can we speed this up is we really encourage all sponsors, including all of these folks that have been here these past 2 days with these really exciting novel technologies, to come to the agency early and often so that we can sit down with you and help you figure out what are going to be the hurdles in designing that pivotal clinical study that will hopefully lead to a favorable review and an approval or clearance by the agency. So that, in my experience at the agency, when sponsors come to us early and often, that timeline does get shortened quite a bit. We don't have full control over the timeline, but we can certainly expedite the process. I think I'll stop there and ask my colleague Allison to add a few more comments, and then I can come back with a couple additional comments as needed.
Sure. So, hi, my name is Allison Kumar, and I am in the Office of the Center Director in the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. And my main role is within a specialized program that focuses on an area of unmet public health needs. What we try to do is focus on ways where we can interact on more of an individual and one-on-one basis with companies that are really developing innovative technologies, novel technologies that could help bridge some of these barriers to patient care that we have. So one of the goals of our center, our mission, is to ensure that our U.S. citizens, the public, have access to medical devices first in the world. And that's great to say, but it actually has taken a lot more work than it takes to just say it. What we realized is just doing the stamp of clearance or providing approval doesn't necessarily get access to patients first in the world. So what could we do to overcome that hurdle in and of itself? And there were multiple programs that and initiatives that we started based on a review of years worth of data that had been collected in the center. But one I think that would be of most interest to this particular discussion is approaching our sister agency, CMS, to say, hey, why don't we go down this road together in a parallel fashion and do our reviews so that we don't have to have a manufacturer come to us, wait for us to make a decision, and then go to you and wait for you to make a decision and tack on millions of dollars and years and years and years down the road. So that was something that we embarked upon with CMS. And we're learning from that experience. We're learning that the bars are different between our agencies, where we ask for endpoints that meet and show safety and effectiveness for patients, that CMS is interested in different outcomes and endpoints. They're looking at rehospitalization measures and improved outcomes in patients. And those, it's difficult to correlate those two measurements within one type of clinical trial. So we continue to look for ways to reduce and shorten that timeline. And I think that it will be effective. I think that the more awareness that can be brought to it by more patients speaking out that this is an important topic that our two agencies need to focus on, and that there's a stick for insurers to focus on this. What we would like to see is also private payers become involved in this conversation. And that we really move, as Peter was saying, to have this conversation early and often, but it's even before we start to begin that clinical trial. It's when you have that idea of a prototype where we can start to go down that road together to say, okay, what is your intended patient population? And how specific or how broad can we be to include all the different types of patients that may benefit from this particular therapy or diagnostic tool? So those are some of the activities that we're doing within our center.
Thanks, Allison. Congressman, let me put this in a little context that we've been talking about for the last 2 days in this conference, and what adds some urgency to this. So one of the problems in both the mental health and addictions field is many of our treatments are old. So we have almost 100 psychiatric drugs that have been approved and are being used today for a variety, bipolar, schizophrenia. There's not been a new novel pharmacological compound in 3 decades. So these drugs have been around for 3 decades. In terms of there's some new drugs that have come on with different side effect profiles, but they're not any new in terms of their effectiveness. Most of the psychosocial treatments have been around for 30 to 40 years. I'm a psychiatrist for 40 plus years. When I trained, cognitive behavioral therapy was a standard of care then. It's still a standard of care. So we have a field where the treatments are not new. We desperately need new, more effective treatments. And our outcomes, if you look at a broad public health basis. Are we all right? Still with us? We still alive over there? Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. Many people have heard the suicide rate has not changed in several decades. About 42,000 people killed themselves last year. And many of you have probably seen that recent study that just came out in the last week to show that the suicide rate in the last 10 years actually increasing, particularly for whites, males and females in middle age. It's jumped up a lot in a 10-year period, mostly due to mental health and substance abuse problems and chronic pain, however you want to count that. So we have 10 times as many people with serious mental illness and addiction problems in jails and prisons than we have in mental health hospitals. And we have the majority of people actually get their care. They don't go to a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a mental health clinic. They go to their primary care doctor. Study after study has shown that less than 13% of the people that go there get minimally adequate care. So we have a situation where you wouldn't be surprised we don't have good outcomes. Half the people are going somewhere where they don't get much specialty care. Many people don't go at all, of course, that's the untreated group. And we don't have any new treatments. And so it's not that some of our treatments aren't effective for people, but one of the reasons this technology came along is to address treatment-resistant depression, which many people don't respond to the first drug they get. So we're trying to, and we've had very good cooperation from our FDA colleagues and from all the different industry people we're hearing from and the advocates about how do we craft a strategy from making this more of a public health emergency, like was done with AIDS or certain rare drugs or some of the cancer drugs, to see if we can't get a coordinated payer and regulatory process. In this case, the FDA was not the major holdup. They are with some other people. They feel like it's taken a really long time. It's been very difficult. So we weren't trying to put you on the spot like you've got all the answers. We've already wanted you to learn where we are with this time and kind of brainstorm with us now and later over what could we do to kind of streamline this process. I don't know if you have any responses or thoughts, just what we've talked about so far, but.
I don't have any really insightful, but I will say something anyway.
Well, that's like the rest of it.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I'm sitting here, sort of like I ran against a scientist, a mathematician once, and I represent Pax River, which is a research, development, test, and evaluation facility for airframes, 22,000 people. And he went on site and said, look, I'm a scientist, I'm a mathematician, I can understand what you do. And so you really ought to elect me to Congress. And so the press came to me. Now, of course, I'm a lawyer. What do I know? Press came to me and said, well, he says he's a scientist and he understands all of what they're doing, the research, development, test, evaluation. And I said, well, I think that's right. And he looked at me. And I said, I really don't, I'm sure, understand as much of exactly what they do as he does. What I understand is how to get them the money to do it. I won that election. My point being that the Congress clearly, not experts, there's some, but is very concerned about the lack of patient access and the amount of time it takes. And Chris, one of the things I would suggest in your slideshow that you did, I don't know whether you know Bob Fischel. Bob Fischel invented the stent. He's a good friend of mine from Maryland, lives in Columbia. You want to have on that slide a comparison. Comparison, what does it take you to do in the United States and what does it take you to do it in Europe? And what are the outcomes in terms of safety at the end of the process? His contention, of course, is it's a lot shorter time in Europe. Now, what I don't know, and Bob has not told me, does that impact the outcomes? Because obviously if it impacts adversely the outcomes, then they're moving too quickly and without sufficient thoroughness. As you know, we just passed the 21st Century Cures Act through the Senate. There's an analogous bill through the House, analogous bill through the Senate. Obviously, that is trying to get, in the House bill, I think we have $550 million, is that right? Additional resources. In addition, as you know, we just made a budget deal, which put $33 billion extra in non-defense discretionary spending, of which probably $8 to $9 billion will go into, for this year, go into the labor health bill, and a portion of that will go in NIH and FDA and other agencies to see whether or not, if resources are the problem. Now, Peter, you indicated it was not necessarily resources.
Well, that's not true. We always can hire more people.
Well, let me ask you, Peter.
What a shocking answer for a congressman to get. That
no. Go ahead.
Peter, how many staff do you have like you that are experts in behavioral health to be a reviewer? Are you
right.
it?
In my division, we just recently lost a psychiatrist over to our friends over at the National Institute of Mental Health. But right now, I'm it. There's 2 other neurologists in my division. We're about to bring on a physiatrist, and we have another person who's a longtime clinical expert in neurology and psychiatry. So with regard to the medical officers who review the pivotal clinical study for safety and effectiveness, we are a little bit short-staffed, but we also rely very heavily on our engineering colleagues because, in my opinion, they're among the smartest people in the world that I've ever met. I mean, I used to look at EEGs and read them all the time, but I had no idea how an EEG machine works.
Peter, the point I wanted to make is there is often a disconnect between the Congress's concern for more rapidly providing access for patients to new medical devices, new drugs, therapies, et cetera, and the willingness of Congress to appropriate sufficient resources to accomplish that acceleration of the process. As you know, we've been under a sequester. Sequester is a complicated word, starts with S, which stands for stupid. And the reason is because it is unrelated to needs and opportunities and responsibilities. It was just a number. And because it was unrelated to needs and opportunities and responsibilities, the number did not necessarily give to the appropriators sufficient resources to accomplish the objectives that the Congress has asked these folks to accomplish. So in many respects, as Peter just pointed out, Congress's expectation, the private sector's expectation, and the private sector's needs, as well as the patients, as the individuals need, there's a disconnect between what we want to do and what we give FDA or NIH the resources to do. And that is one of the debates that's going on in this country right now. Now, one of the good things is we've passed the Affordable Care Act. Right. The Affordable Care Act obviously was, in large respects, directed at mental health. The Mental Health Parity Act that you talked about, Patrick Kennedy was in the Congress, a co-sponsor on my side of the aisle. B. Rogers and I, Betty McGarvey and I, for a long period of time with a number of you, probably in the audience, when I was in the state Senate. We're talking about how we get parity in dealing with physical health and mental health, on the premise that if you're going to have a healthy human being, you need to pay attention to both. And we ought to have parity in terms of resources and access. As you know, under the Affordable Care Act, we mandated parity so that there are resources available. Now, obviously, Chris, your point is if you can't get on the list of a compensable use of the product,
Well, let's talk
about the reach.
Let's maybe talk a little bit about that, because while there's a resource issue here, I think probably administrative resource in terms of reviews, the Affordable Care Act and the federal parity bill that preceded it did expand coverage tremendously to this country for, for both health care, but also for behavioral health care. However, the parity law, which did require equal coverage and has a requirement in the parity regulations and bill that when an insurance company reviews a behavioral health technology or treatment versus a medical surgical one, they have to use the same criteria and they can't be more restrictive. Unfortunately, that kind of area has not been fully enforced by the Department of Labor and HHS. Not the FDA, that's not their role, but so they did issue regulations, even though they were 5 years after the law passed. And they've not issued additional guidance or enforcement activities that would, when we would bring an appeals case like this on, and there have been with TMS specifically and other new treatments, the insurance companies do not feel obligated to divulge transparency about how they're reviewing this. So you can't even document they're out of compliance. There've been a lot of meetings with many of the advocacy groups, the Kennedy Forum, with Department of Labor. They actually just issued a little bit of extra guidance 2 weeks ago, but it's not sufficient yet to kind of close off the loopholes. So frankly, that would go a long way towards at least saying, okay, you've got an approved treatment. I mean, to have 16 research studies is more than most medical areas in terms of what they're approved and paid for routinely. And I think Chris's background here of having worked mostly for non-behavioral companies and knows that experience, sort of you're having a hard time believing what you're having to go through here. So it's sort of an unfulfilled promise. The other issue is Medicaid. So the parity bill regulates Medicaid health plans, and we're now 7 years post the passage of the law, and no regulations have been issued on Medicaid parity. So that's, to me, it's like this, you don't have to appropriate new money for this. This is enforcing a current law that requires equal coverage, and it's not being fully implemented, and particularly for these new treatments. That's the sad part. So maybe we could come back and maybe talk after this about some ways to...
Let me just make a brief comment on that, because one of the problems that we've had since, as you point out, the adoption, then January 2014 implementation, is in the Congress, we ought to have oversight of that. We ought to be looking at why the bill is not working as well as we want it to.
Right.
Unfortunately, we've been stuck at two poles. One is that we will repeal the bill. So seeing how well or how poorly it performs has not been the subject of real oversight hearings. And on the other side, there's great fear that any action that's taken will be to repeal the bill. But the hearings that should have occurred have not occurred. Now, I think Fred Upton is very interested in how not only the Affordable Care Act is performing in a more positive aspect than just repeal, but oversight as to why we are not acting in a way that will get us to the place where we want to be.
I agree. I understand that that's been a statement, particularly on the ACA. But on the parity bill, which was a bipartisan bill, I think it's probably, I hope, a little bit easier. It still hasn't had the regulatory force effectively yet, but hopefully we don't have to have the same kind of stalemate you've got on the Affordable Care Act.
Well, as you know, we're about to have a stalemate on Tim Murphy's bill, where we have, we originally thought that bill was going to be very bipartisan. And it is now, there are so many concerns about the privacy rights, the
Right.
HIPAA impacts,
Right.
the civil rights of those
Right.
with disabilities, that's now becoming mired in another partisan battle,
I've
unfortunately.
heard this.
Yeah.
But I think this is some help from you and Senator Cardin, both houses and both parties, on just finally closing the loopholes. I mean, to me, I don't see any rationale for not issuing the regulations on Medicaid. I mean, Medicaid is the biggest payer for mental health, partly because the commercial insurers don't cover fully like they do medical. And of course, with the expansion of Medicaid through the Medicaid Expansion Act of the ACA, it's an even bigger thing, and yet we have no parity protections as yet. So that's an area that would help a lot of kind of, but I think there are potentially other, Chris, do you want to respond
Yeah,
to that?
so I think, there's two races as defined it from the sheet of paper to the FDA clearance, right? And, Peter talked about something very briefly here, which is a pre-submission discussion. So you work for several years on your product, and then many companies, believe it or not, be interested to hear what the statistic is. How many companies actually come to you with their final clinical without even asking for a pre-sub conversation?
I really don't know, but it's more than we would like.
Yeah.
Because then you run into the problem of them coming in with a marketing application that they did the wrong study.
Right.
And we have to tell them that, and we don't want to send companies back to the drawing board because that costs money and it costs time.
Uh-huh. And what year, how far ago did the FDA adopt this idea of pre-submission conversations?
That pathway has been around for as long as I've been at the agency.
Before the pre-submission process, we called it the pre-IDE process. That, however, gave the impression that it was really just an early conversation about a potential clinical trial or investigative study that you would like to do with an investigational device. So maybe 2 years ago, I believe, we opened it up to call it pre-submission. So you can come and have any conversation that you would like very, very early in the development process, clinical trial development process, bench testing study. If you're doing animal studies, you can come and talk to us, ask us any questions you'd like, and we would give you our feedback.
So that's a significant improvement, has streamlined the process. As a company, as an executive or a company, you're just trying to reduce your risk and understand what the risk is. And a lot of companies would put together their trial without having a conversation with either Allison and Peter, and they'd be surprised to hear that they don't get approved, right? So a couple of things have happened one is the FDA has made it widely known that the pre-sub exists. We just actually had one with the FDA, and it's very constructive. And all you want to know then is what's your likelihood of getting approval? And we could say, well, we're not going to listen to you, and we're just going to do it the way we want. And well, that's probably not going to turn out so well, right? So that's the FDA part, right? That consumes 2, 3, depending on how big the study is, how important, right, safety and efficacy is, right? So my comments was we are the leader, right, in healthcare quality because we do have the FDA. There's a happy balance between testing and proving and evidence-based decision making versus other markets where I could go tomorrow and get a product approved, literally in months, right? So that's why we have this great quality of healthcare in the United States. But the second part of this is really obscure, opaque, which is this reimbursement catch-22, right? To get coverage, right? To get coverage, you have to show demand. So who do we go to? We start with private pay, and then you are providing health care for the rich. We had to go and charge people $12,000 to $14,000 for this treatment. And you might say, why do you charge so much? If we charge $500, right, to get people to use it, at the end of the Medicare process, Medicare then goes back and does a survey and says, how much are you charging? We said $500 because we had to create demand so you give us coverage. And they say, well, we'll only pay you $500 now for it.
One of the
yin
questions
and yang of this whole process is, so what we would love to see, and this is not just for behavioral health, right? This is not just for behavioral health. I think that this is across all of medical devices. I think we do have a sword in our hand finally in behavioral health, right? The Healthcare Parity Act, that we might be able to say, listen, so for these sorts of products, there's a real unmet need here. There's 4,000 patients that are treatment resistant right now in the United States. Why don't we fast track it and find a way to to regulate the payers. How can a payer at this stage tell me, and what do you think their motivation is? Why is it that they're saying non-coverage, we're not approved, you're still experimental after 5 years, and I have hundreds of other payers? What's in it for them? What do you think?
One of the questions I'd have, one of the questions I'd have, Congressman, will the 21st Century's bill address any of these kind of speedier regulatory
We'll
practices?
put more money in the FDA.
It would,
For
okay.
the purposes of
Right.
550 million over, I guess, is it over 10, Rachel? Over 10, so it's 55 million a year, but it's for trying to accelerate, which gives more resources. I mean, ultimately, it gets down to if you have one person that's reviewing, or two people, presumably you do twice as much, or do it in half the time. You've got to make sure the resources, and 21st Century Cures in part deals with
Okay.
the resources.
Are there any questions from the audience that people
Can I
have?
just
Or one?
add-
Yeah,
can
go
I
ahead.
just
I'm
add
sorry.
something? I just want follow up on Congressman Hoyer's point. Since FDA has really worked hard to streamline the investigational device exemption process, so those are for highly significant risky devices that require to be studied under an IDE. About 3 or 4 years ago, the average time to get an IDE approved was a little over 400 days, I believe it was. But since we started to work more interactively with sponsors to fix the deficiencies in their study, that approval has now come down to 30 days. And part of that is when President Obama signed the act in 2012 that reauthorized the FDA to do what they do as part of the negotiations. I don't know if many of you are familiar with is the fact that companies like Chris's pay FDA a user fee in order for us to review their products. And part of those user fees, in addition to what Congress gives us, goes into hiring the key people that need to be at the agency to review these products.
Peter, let me be clear. That's on the drug side.
That's on the device side.
On the
too.
device side?
Yep, there's the
Medical device
PDUFA, which is the pharmaceutical, and then there's MDUFA, which is the medical device user fee.
And this greater transparency, you've had to post the number of days
Yes.
on the website.
Yes.
One thing
So-
some people may not be aware of is that because of the limitations of many of the psychiatric drugs, they help like maybe 40% of the time and don't help, and we don't know which one works for who, usually at the beginning. So many of the pharma companies have withdrawn from the behavioral space, okay? Not all. There's less interest in it, partly because they can't find a blockbuster drug. And that's not all bad news, partly because people are realizing these drugs only help a subset of patients. But there's been a tremendous growth on the research side of what we call these non-invasive neuromodulation interventions, which is TMS is one type. So there's been a tremendous amount of research, but they're coming in, and we don't want them all to be treated like Chris is treated on the reimbursement side, that they're novel to the mental health field, but these are the new treatments that we need because we've changed our understanding of the brain physiology. It's not, the compounds don't work the same way you would want them to do. You're trying to modulate the different circuits of the brain. So it's really important to try to get this fixed so we can get some of these more effective treatments out the door. So do we have a...
Yeah, just have a question, and this would be for Mr.
Sure, Peter.
In regarding to the FDA having such a set amount of people that can go through the clinical studies, go through the whole vetting process of something new. With the size of the bureaucracy, why have we not, as a country, changed the course to actually make that go through quicker, such as what you were talking about, by getting it to the public quicker, instead of having it be 9 years, like was up on the draft?
Yeah, actually, I know this is going to sound crazy coming from someone who's a federal employee, but the bureaucracy at the FDA isn't as onerous as people think. Basically, a file comes to a division for review. The review team makes a recommendation to the division director about whether to approve or disapprove a product. And, and then that's usually also, for many products, it stops right at the division level. For other products that are riskier, like things that would be implanted, like deep brain stimulators, if it's the first of its kind or it's for a new condition, we then may have to take that to an external advisory panel of experts in the field who help us decide. And that adds a layer of time to it. But in my experience at the FDA, I've been at the agency for 6 years, I have not found that process to be overly onerous with regard to the bureaucracy. Once a division signs off on a product, it usually is cleared. And just to get back to those user fees, part of those user fees come with specific mandated deadlines by which we have to review and make a decision on a product. Some of those deadlines are as short as 30 days, some are 90 days. The holdup.
Can they pull the fees back?
The holdup that sometimes happens is if a product comes into us and as the review team reviews the file, what happens inevitably is additional questions get raised. Either I raise questions about the clinical data, the statisticians raise questions about the results and how they were analyzed. So then we have to go back to the company. It doesn't mean you're dead in the water. It just says, Neuronetics, we're a little puzzled about all these different aspects of your study and the results. Can you please address these, we call them deficiencies? And then if a company comes back in and satisfactorily gives us the information that we found lacking in the file, then we can go ahead and make a regulatory decision. But then again, that adds a little bit more to the timeline because after, say, 90 days or before 90 days, we send those questions back to the company. They have a period of time. They may need to go back and reanalyze stuff. They may need to find out more information. Then they come back to us and say, okay, here's the information you wanted.
Okay,
So,
we got time for one more question.
sorry.
All right.
So as I listen to the story of trying to bring this treatment to the market and to people who could benefit from it, it sounds to me like that between the company and the FDA, there's a working relationship and you understand what each person's role is. But the problem and the objectionable part is in that second part of the journey and the $104 million that's essentially wasted. What is the solution to that problem? A single payer system would work great and it would probably become transparent. But given the fact that we are a country that's chosen this other option, how do we make everyone play by the same rules and be what seems to be like a willing partner to make rational decisions together?
Well,
That is the crux. That
Yeah.
is the crux. I know in the past there's been a lot of heat on the FDA, but Peter just shared with you, it went from 400 days down to 40 days, and it has, right? And my timeline was 6 years from a sheet of paper to approval. The FDA was a very small part of it. Having the pre-sub meeting, getting the clinical right and doing that was most of our time. It wasn't really negotiations or asking a bunch of questions of why'd this doesn't look good. So that really is not our holdup. The holdup is exactly what you talked about, which is about understanding what the rules of the road are once you get the approval in an area where reimbursement doesn't exist. And insurers are not held or obligated to move through this anytime quickly.
I think this is clearly, we have other problems besides TMS. It's a parity enforcement problem and additional regulatory enforcement to basically close the loopholes in the law that exists in the regulation. So, but the parity law doesn't regulate Medicare, so that's a separate issue about whether we could maybe get better coordination with Medicare at the same time you get FDA approval, could move faster, particularly on these desperately needed new mental health treatments. But I want to thank.
Can I just make a comment?
You get the last word.
You mentioned Singer. Well, I don't have the last word because I'm the least knowledgeable. But during the course of the consideration of the Affordable Care Act, there was discussion, of course, about single payer. That did not have much support broadly in the Congress of the United States. On our side of the aisle, one of the things that did have broad support was a public option, which would have been another analog which would have put pressure, competitive pressure, on other insurers to provide at competitive prices such coverage. That was not adopted either, as you know, so it is still and when people talk to me about socialized medicine, what the Affordable Care Act, as you know, is a marketplace for private sector providers of insurance, not providers, but insurance. And so that was one option to try to create a more competitive model that might have led to more broader coverage at an affordable price.
Well, thank you, for all of you, to participate in this. I hope we can follow up and start addressing some of these areas we have control over. And
Well, the Congress is working very effectively and efficiently, so I'm sure.
there you go. That's a good ride to end on. All right. Thank you.